My name is Tim Schaefer. I'm with the National Institute for Civil Discourse. This brief video is a walkthrough of the slides that have been put together for the Open Discussion Project, which is a project of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, the National Coalition Against Censorship, and American Booksellers Association, and including you, a local bookstore, as well as facilitators who are helping to make this possible. So what I want to do is just to walk through the slides so you have a sense of what they are, what they include, and how you might use them. These have been put together to walk through the different parts of the initial meeting, the organizing meeting as we've called it, which will last roughly 90 minutes, comprised of 5 different parts. The accompanying document will give more detail there. These are just some of the accompanying slides that you may want to use. Feel free to adjust, to add to, or change some of this a little bit, especially in part 2, but the other content we'd ask that you probably leave there just for uniformity, as this is a pilot project for something larger that might go to scale. So I just want to walk through these slides. So the first one is just a very simple cover. Really in this first part we're going to welcome people to the space. It'd be great to have bookstore owners, managers introduce, kind of help frame this conversation in the particular location, and invite participants to introduce themselves. There's a little bit of an explanation here of what the National Institute for Civil Discourse does, which is largely bringing people together for these kinds of conversations in a variety of settings. Why this is framed this way is that it builds on the idea that these types of discussions are not new. These are woven into the fabric of kind of the American experience, and we really want to see the importance of civil and thoughtful discussion happening about contemporary issues, but realizing it's part of a much longer story, which is partly why this slide is included here. M.L. Wilson was an educator from Montana, eventually worked in the United States Department of Agriculture, but led a project in the 1930s and 40s that really brought people together, and particularly rural communities, but also in suburban and urban spaces where people were talking about contentious issues. So this idea that free and full discussion is the archstone of democracy, it's what holds up the rest of it, is an important theme to draw on from this kind of longer history of the American experience. And this will lead us into the second part of the meeting. After people have introduced themselves, you're going to want to frame a little bit of what's going on in the current state of American political life and social life. So what you find here are 3 books that have some ability to frame this conversation. The first is Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, originally an essay and then published as a book. His argument was, by looking through data through the 20th century, that people were stepping away from kind of civic life, not participating in bowling leagues, for example, or various other civic organizations, and in fact were choosing to, quote, bowl alone or with their family. They were not interacting with diverse people as they might have been previously. Bill Bishop's book, which became fairly popular, called The Big Sort, identified that people were existing in these kind of clustered, like-minded communities, and further reinforcing the language increasingly now popular of bubbles, these kind of echo chambers. The worlds that we live in, whether it's the workplace, it's the neighborhoods that we live in, the houses of worship, if we choose to participate in those things, looking very much like us, not necessarily representing a great deal of diversity. And then finally, the most recent example here comes from the book The Vanishing Neighbor, which highlights the significance of the immediate kind of inner circle of our lives, our family and close friends. And there are 2 other rings. The third outer ring is also where we're highly involved, the single issue kind of advocacy issues, kind of concerns. But what is really missing, and what he argues is vanishing, is this second, kind of this middle ring of interaction with our neighbors, those that we don't routinely interact with on a day-to-day basis, but are part of the social fabric around us. So these are just some examples that you might want to lean on. The next 2 slides come from The Big Sort, One is this image from 1976, kind of the politics before the sort, as he calls it, and then uses another image from 2004. What's important here and why you might want to use this is identifying all the white on the map. These are competitive counties. So these are counties across the United States, the 48 here. And what you see is from 1976 to 2004, significant loss in the competitive counties. And part of the argument here is that we're increasingly, and we can see here visually, the clustering of people ideologically where they live. And what are the impacts on our kind of shared civic life when that happens? More recently, the American Psychological Association has done some research and pointing all the way from millennials through Gen Xers, baby boomers, and then older adults, that people are saying this is the lowest point in our nation's history that they can remember. And these are for people who have lived through very significant, impactful events in American history. So this is something really worthwhile to note. Some stressors, similarly coming from some of this research, 63% are really concerned and stressed about the future of our nation. This is an alarming kind of list of issues, and part of this is that we can offer some response. The Open Discussion Project is one small way of doing that. This slide and the next one you may not want to include. This may take it beyond the scale that you are interested or comfortable, but this comes from an international research project looking at data from every country from 1900 to, and this one goes to 2017. What we're seeing, looking at these democratic practices, is that for the first time since 1979, the number of countries backsliding, stepping away from democratic practices, are equal to those advancing in more democratic ways. Why this is important is that a third of the world's population, 2.5 billion people, are experiencing shifts towards kind of autocratic government. So the rise of authoritarians across the United States and including around the world, including the United States. This is an important backdrop that you may want to include. It may take you beyond the conversation you want to have. And if you feel like this might be more of a distraction or take you off course, then you may not want to use this. So here's the second slide to that, just to see some of the visual. And what you can see here on the right side are some of these trend lines going down in our recent past. A slide that I would encourage you to keep, though, is this. Recently pointing to 80% of Americans being concerned that the lack of civility in politics will lead to violence. So the idea that having civil discourse is an important piece. This highlights why that is the case, that there are in fact people who are very concerned about violence erupting, and we've seen examples of that, but further being exacerbated in some significant ways, which leads us to part 3. This is really focusing on this idea of active listening. So part of the conversations that will unfold going forward really require people to be open and engaging with one another. And so what we're asking people is to really approach with curiosity, to suspend judgment, to try to understand maybe some of the underlying values that leads to somebody's view, even if they're in opposition to your own. Now, finding where are those places of agreement, but also acknowledging that we're not going to necessarily walk out all on the same page. This is not the pursuit of consensus, for example. So inviting people to really think a little bit about this idea of active listening, and then having some questions using a process called think, pair, share, which I'll explain here. So fundamentally, asking this first question: why is it difficult to discuss and disagree on topics that we care deeply about? And so using think, pair, share, inviting people to think about this individually, and then pairing ideally with one other person. Depending on the size of the group, you may need a few people to kind of cluster. And then finally, the share element here is kind of a popcorn style of everybody sharing in the larger group. But really asking that first question: why is it difficult to discuss these things that we care deeply about? And then moving, when appropriate, especially after they've already been in the pairing, and maybe when you've got the whole group back together, asking these questions. What does it mean to be heard? To think about a time when you needed to be understood and you didn't feel you were being heard, and then the opposite of that, thinking about a time when you felt completely heard and understood. We have allocated about 20 minutes for this exercise, and again, you can adjust accordingly to how you see fit. This does not have to be exhaustive, especially when you're back in the large group, but it is important to create some space and opportunities for people to articulate some of their expectations, and for some of them may being introduced to the idea of active listening or some of these terms for a first time. So this, when that kind of comes naturally to a close, we'll transition to part 4, which is kind of a video that embodies some of these ideas that would have just been discussed. So this is called Unlikely Friendships. It's a video including 2 people called Donna and Bob. It's been used quite a bit in a number of NICD projects, and it's a really good demonstration of how people who have really distinct views of the world and experiences can engage one another in some meaningful ways. Included in the accompanying document, you can go to the YouTube link to show this. The video is 4.5 minutes long, but it's also embedded within these slides. So I would encourage you, for simplicity's sake, if you're going to use some of these slides and have the capacity to do that, to just use the video that's embedded here. But you are welcome to use YouTube otherwise through a web browser, just realizing you'll have to move back and forth. So you can just click right through. You're not going to hear the audio in just a moment. It will bring you to this screen, and then you will hit the cursor. You can click the screen or use the right arrow button, and it will take you to the video. Again, you're not going to hear it right now because I'm using headphones to do this video, but you will begin to hear the audio playing here. So when that video is completed, you will really invite the participants to share some reactions, and we've again on the other document identified using only about 10 minutes for this, because you don't need to be exhaustive here, but to spur some further conversation of what was surprising to you in this video. Maybe what are some of the lingering questions about their interaction that would be worthwhile to kind of posit as a group. Then leading fundamentally to this, what can we learn from their friendship that would be helpful for thinking about the Open Discussion Project and how things want to go forward? Because you are going to find there are some people who have distinct, very strong, expressed maybe dramatically views differing from others in the room, and so you want to be able to navigate this through the tools of active listening, as well as attending to and having this as a reference point for being able to engage even if you do not agree. So this will lead us to the last piece, so part 5, which is really where this organizing meeting points us towards the future. Depending on your group, how you've chosen to structure some of this, maybe some of it's already been predetermined, but this may also be the space where you need to do some of that as well, figuring out your next steps of determining which books are going to be discussed in subsequent meetings, and then also figuring out dates and times for your group, so you can commit at this point to ensure the books are available, the rooms are also available, those kinds of things. So this next step, and for this initial meeting, this is the last piece, is really important. Don't diminish this. So if you need to adjust some of the other content for time's sake, you want to ensure that you have enough time here. Again, you may have a sign-up sheet at the beginning or some way to document people if folks have registered through Facebook or some other means. You may already have their contact information. This also might be a really good place to use a sign-up sheet or some other way to document who is participating. And so that is the end of the slide deck. Again, you are able to adjust and use some of the materials, some of the slides, particularly in part 2, you may feel are beyond the scope of what you're trying to do, especially the data, the global data from VDIM. But we would encourage you to use the others just for a degree of uniformity across the board, as this is a beta project and trying to figure out how to develop this more broadly beyond your work. So thank you very much for being part of this. If you have questions about any of the slides of information, about some of the structure for this initial organizing meeting, please don't hesitate to contact us. I'm happy to serve as a point person. We have others who could be useful if that is essential for you. Again, any questions, don't hesitate to contact us, and we look forward to hearing how your conversations go. The last thing I will say is that we do have a shared document, a Google document, where you can give some feedback from your experience of this initial meeting and for you to interact a little bit to see how some of the other groups are going. That link is available in the accompanying document called Facilitator Organizing Meeting. Look forward to hearing how everything goes. Thanks so much.